Breaking news this lunchtime, the UK's COVID-19 inquiry has just published its fourth report, which looked at the development of COVID vaccines and the vaccine rollout programme during the pandemic. Our science correspondent Thomas Moore joins us. And Thomas, the headline from this is that the vaccine and therapeutics response was, in many ways, according to the inquiry, a success story.
Yes, it's seen as a shining light. This is the fourth of 10 reports we're expecting from the long-running COVID inquiry, and it did look into vaccines and therapeutics, but it says there were problems all the way along the line, and that the government needs to rebuild trust in the vaccine now. So let's just start on the positive. It says that the development of the vaccines was at a blistering pace, unlike anything the UK has seen before, and that was built on the excellent biomedical science base that the UK had at the time, at the start of the pandemic. And in the first 9 months, the jabs prevented more than 123,000 deaths in the UK. But not everybody shared equally in that success. Some groups were much harder to reach. There was suspicion and mistrust of the vaccine and of authority in some ethnic minority groups and in communities with high levels of deprivation. Now, they were more susceptible to the misinformation that was online over the safety of the vaccine. That was compounded by the rapid development of a new vaccine, and that mistrust led to lower levels of uptake, and therefore some people more vulnerable to the virus. But the inquiry chair, Baroness Hallett, says the government does need to work hard to address that level of trust within those communities to ensure that there is no repeat come the next pandemic, which will surely come, as scientists now believe. There is also strong criticism over the government's compensation scheme for those who do, in very rare circumstances, suffer harm, significant harm from the vaccine. We know that there have been several thousand people who have applied to what's called the Vaccine Damage Payment Scheme. Now, at the moment, they have to prove 60% disability based on industrial injuries that's decades old, and that's inadequate for something like a pandemic caused by a virus, says the inquiry. They also get £120,000. It is a one-off payment, and that is inadequate for someone who is the main wage earner of a young family, for example, and some people are suffering great financial hardship as a result. Now, the report says the payment needs to be increased, that there shouldn't be an all-or-nothing threshold for compensation, and instead the payment should be based on the level of injury. Now, all this is really significant because, of course, vaccination is like a social contract. We roll up our sleeves to protect the whole of society. But the report is very clear that unless the government does address these failings, the rollout of the vaccine come the next pandemic may not go so well.
And talk to us about how this element fits amongst the other modules that we've had feedback on so far, because some of the other evidence that Baroness Hallett heard and then reviewed points to a rather shambolic response to the pandemic. Is the vaccine rollout in a slightly different tier compared to some of the other government responses? Yeah, very much so. It's not like the shambolic response in Number 10 and other government departments at the time, where there didn't seem to be any clear direction and not always led by the evidence. The vaccination rollout went extremely well. You would take us back to those days, and you remember how the country was mobilised. Huge numbers of volunteers answered the call to come in and marshal the enormous numbers coming through for their jab, up to 1 million a day at its peak. It was quite extraordinary, and that was only possible because of the good work that had been done leading up to the pandemic, the biomedical science that we had, the base that we had there, but then how the health service responded. So that went extremely well, but it still identifies some failings. It could have gone much better, and that's the point of this inquiry, to learn from what happened to better prepare for the future, and we could do better. The UK's inquiry has been criticised for the cost and the duration of the inquiry's scope. Other countries have already wrapped up theirs, and of course we're kind of, 6 years on since the start of the pandemic. How much more are we expecting to hear from Baroness Hallett? And at what point will we finally get all of the answers and all of the conclusions?
Well, it's cost £200 million so far.
Today I published the fourth report of the UK COVID-19 inquiry. It covers the development and deployment of vaccines and therapeutics in the UK during the COVID-19 pandemic. In many ways, the development, manufacture and distribution of effective vaccines to prevent COVID-19 and the identification of an effective therapeutic or drug to treat COVID patients are two of the success stories of the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic was caused by a new pathogen, SARS-CoV-2. As a result, there were no vaccines and no clinically proven therapeutics or drugs available to combat the disease at the start of the pandemic. The discovery, development and approval of new vaccines can take between 10 and 20 years. But within a year of its first case of COVID-19, the UK had developed the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine and had authorised access to two more, the Pfizer-BioNTech and the Moderna vaccines. It began vaccinating in December 2020 before any other European country. In 2021, about 132 million COVID-19 vaccinations were given across the 4 nations of the UK, making it the largest vaccination programme in UK history. The vaccines offered significant protection against serious illness and death. One study estimated that the UK COVID-19 vaccines saved almost 450,000 lives of people aged 25 or older in England and over 25,000 in Scotland up until March 2023. Wales and Northern Ireland were not included in the study. This success was built on decades of global research and preparation, including research to develop the mRNA vaccines, many of which were conceived as cancer vaccines, and previous work on vaccine platform technologies. The UK's formidable science and clinical research infrastructure, existing networks such as the UK Vaccine Network, the excellent work of the UK's temporary task forces, in particular the Vaccine Task Force, the willingness of the UK government to adopt an at-risk approach to funding vaccine development, and the innovative approach adopted by the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency for the authorisation of the vaccines, working in partnership with the pharmaceutical industry. In short, it depended on a huge collaborative effort on the part of the private and public sectors and academia. Vaccines alone are not enough. They may not work against every pathogen, they may not be suitable for everyone, and it may take years to develop one that is effective. Therapeutics are therefore an essential tool in the response armoury. They were used to target the COVID-19 virus as well as to treat associated medical complications. The UK's recovery trial identified arguably the single most important therapeutic of the pandemic, namely dexamethasone, the anti-inflammatory drug used to treat COVID-19 patients. By March 2021, dexamethasone is estimated to have saved 22,000 lives in the UK and 1 million lives across the globe. The unknown nature of the next pandemic therefore requires a range of vaccines and therapeutics to be developed, which can be pivoted to combat a new pathogen. To do this, it is crucial to maintain the UK's vaccine and therapeutics infrastructure by continued investment, to support research and development capabilities, and to maintain the close links between government, academia and industry that proved so successful in the COVID-19 pandemic. The UK has a world-class reputation in biomedical research, but research and the development of vaccines is only one side of the equation. We need to be able to regulate, manufacture and distribute the vaccines at pace. Turning to the distribution of the vaccines and therapeutics, the vaccine delivery programmes across the UK were also largely successful. By July 2021, almost 87% of the adult population in England had received at least one vaccination dose. In Scotland and Wales, this figure was about 90%, and in Northern Ireland, it was nearly 82%. This success was due to those who planned and operated the vaccine programmes, the extraordinary efforts of people across the UK who helped to deliver them, and those in the healthcare systems in each of the 4 nations who ensured efficient and coordinated delivery. That is not to say that lessons cannot be learned from the vaccine rollout. The system depended on placing groups of people into cohorts to prioritise those deemed most at risk from the COVID-19 virus. Deciding how particular groups should be prioritised, such as pregnant women, unpaid carers, and people with learning disabilities, was far from straightforward. And the communications concerning eligibility caused confusion in some groups. In relation to access to therapeutics within the community, access was restricted to narrowly confined groups according to clinical vulnerability. There was some confusion as to who might be eligible for antivirals. In any future pandemic, messaging in relation to eligibility criteria should be clear and easily understandable. While the majority of people took up the offer of vaccination when it was made, there was lower uptake within communities in areas of high. For many, their concerns centred on the safety of vaccines and possible side effects. To some extent, this lack of confidence in COVID-19 vaccinations was a global issue, fuelled by the rapid sharing of false information online. However, it's clear that a lack of trust and confidence in authority was also a significant contributing factor in the UK. Governments and health services must work with communities to rebuild trust and promote a better understanding of and confidence in vaccines. Communities should be reassured by the fact that although almost no drug, vaccine or medical procedure is without risk, there are effective systems in place to assess their safety and efficacy. I have found that COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics were no different. Vaccines were subject to rigorous trialling and regulatory approval before they were rolled out to the 4 nations. Any safety concerns were identified quickly and monitored. However, to further strengthen the system for safety checks, I'm recommending that regulators should have access to up-to-date patient data from across the UK to allow for quicker and more comprehensive monitoring of the effects of new vaccines or therapeutics on the population. Tragically, a number of people suffered harm as a result of having a vaccine. This was a small minority compared to the overall scale of the vaccination programme, but of no less importance to the individuals affected and their families. I heard moving evidence of representatives from the vaccine-injured and bereaved core participant groups who have often felt silenced, ignored, or treated as vaccine deniers. Similar experiences were also described to the inquiry through its listening exercise, Every Story Matters. It is vital in the context of a whole population vaccination programme in which the state is asking people to be vaccinated in part to protect others, that people are adequately supported when side effects do occur. A sufficiently supportive government scheme must be in place to help such people and their loved ones. I have found that the current scheme for those who've been injured as a result of having a vaccine, the Vaccine Damage Payment Scheme, is not sufficiently supportive and requires reform. As well as recommendations about access to data for regulators and reform of the Vaccine Damage Payment Scheme, I make 3 other recommendations which I believe will also ensure that UK is in an even better position to develop and deploy vaccines and therapeutics in the next pandemic. They cover establishing a pharmaceutical expert advisory panel to oversee the UK's preparedness to develop, procure and manufacture both vaccines and therapeutics. Producing targeted vaccination strategies and communications, including consulting with local networks about campaigns and delivery, in order to increase vaccine uptake and reduce inequalities. Improving monitoring and evaluation of vaccine uptake and delivery in order to understand the measures proven to be effective in increasing vaccine uptake. The inquiry has also identified a number of key elements of the UK response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which must be properly embedded in pandemic planning and built upon in order to better prepare for the next pandemic. The rapid and coordinated funding for research and vaccines and therapeutics, the adoption of an at-risk approach to vaccine procurement by funding research and development of a wide range of vaccine candidates, knowing that some will not be successful, to create as many opportunities as possible to discover an effective vaccine. An expedited regulatory approval and recruitment system for clinical trials, as well as expedited authorization of new vaccines and therapeutics without compromising on public safety. The rapid establishment of specialist vaccine and therapeutics task forces to bring together national expertise and to act decisively to coordinate the search for effective vaccines and therapeutics. These approaches worked during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, we must maintain the capability we had in place in 2019-2020 to enable us to fight the next pandemic. We must not allow it to wither. As possible to discover an effective vaccine. An expedited regulatory approval and recruitment system for clinical trials, as well as expedited authorization of new vaccines and therapeutics without compromising on public safety. The rapid establishment of specialist vaccine and therapeutics task forces to bring together national expertise and to act decisively to coordinate the search for effective vaccines and therapeutics. These approaches worked during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, we must maintain the capability we had in place in 2019-2020 to enable us to fight the next pandemic. We must not allow it to wither.
Baroness Hallett there with those comments. Let's bring in our science correspondent, Thomas Moore, who's been listening. Thomas, your analysis.
Yeah, I think it's very clear from listening to Baroness Heather that we shouldn't lose the expertise we had. As you said, as you heard right at the end there, that we shouldn't allow it to wither. We were reasonably well prepared on the vaccines and the therapeutics, the medicines, at the start of the pandemic in 2020. And scientists dumped what they were doing and moved on to the vaccine with extraordinary speed, and that's why we had so many vaccine candidates coming forward. And to see then the work of the other vaccine groups that allowed that to move forward with appropriate government funding and contracts being placed with pharmaceutical companies at a very early stage, long before they'd actually even reached phase 3 clinical trials. That's unheard of. But it's that kind of spread betting, trying to find a vaccine that could be used, acknowledging that some will fall by the wayside, that was so important. It's these kinds of measures that we learnt as we went along through the COVID pandemic that Baroness Hallett wants to see being maintained so that we're well prepared next time around. And also this work to ensure that trust, public trust in the vaccine is rebuilt, that some communities had that shattered. They just didn't believe the government and the authorities during COVID, and as a result they were vulnerable to the virus. That shouldn't happen, she says, and that does need to be addressed.
I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about the challenges, Thomas, that the government had to try and enforce lockdowns as their primary defence against COVID. And if there is to be another pandemic, as researchers say there will be inevitably at some point, having a lockdown a second time round will be even more tricky, I think it's fair to say, based on so many people's experience of the first one and some of the issues that were made clear at the heart of Downing Street as well. So it feels to me as though the need for therapeutics and the need for a swift vaccination campaign, if anything, even more pressing at the next iteration of a pandemic than it was at this one.
That's true. The problem is that it does take time to develop those vaccines. Even with the mRNA vaccines that were developed, it was a blistering pace, and they were hugely effective. Never been tried before in the real world, but they did prove hugely successful. Now, the lessons learnt in their development and the fact you can put genetic code into a vaccine like this and trigger a really good immune response, that would be invaluable come the next pandemic. But there will always be this gap between the start of the lab work and then the rollout, and then all the trials that need to be done to show that it's safe and effective, and then the rollout. So there will always be a period of months where some other intervention could be needed. And you're right, there needs to be trust in government, and that was blown through this pandemic. The feeling that people were being kept in their houses, not necessarily to huge effect if you look at other countries, and that will be very difficult to enforce next time around. But there will need to be some kind of conversation now across society on how we deal with the next pandemic to restore that trust and the belief that politicians really are being led by the evidence.
Let's talk, Thomas, about one of the other elements of Baroness Hallett's comments there about the need for compensation and an increase in compensation for those families and those individuals who say that they were harmed by vaccines. Currently standing at a one-off payment of £120,000, calls for that to be increased. And when you read some of the testimony of some of the impacts that people have borne witness to, you can understand why bereaved families and campaign groups are really pushing hard for further development of this scheme.
Very much so. I mean, we will shortly hear from Kate Scott, who is the wife of Jamie Scott. Now, I met them both 2 years ago, and Jamie suffered brain damage shortly after having a dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine. And he got compensation from the government scheme, but it was £120,000. And he was a man, I think he seemed to remember that he was in his 30s. He had 2 young children. And that is nothing like enough to support the family for the rest of his life.
Let's listen to the families now.
The pandemic has been undermined, and the lessons about what went wrong are still to be learnt. For the COVID bereaved, this is deeply personal. Many of our loved ones died because vaccinations came too late. We know exactly what is at stake when people are left exposed. So the question now is whether the government will do enough to make sure the vaccines can save as many lives as possible when the next pandemic arrives. That means acting now on the lessons in this report. We entered the last pandemic without sufficient drug and vaccine manufacturing capacity. More than 6 years later, nothing has changed. That is unacceptable, and the government needs a serious long-term plan for vaccines alongside therapeutics, antivirals and prophylactics. It needs the capacity, funding and resilience to move quickly in a crisis. Importantly, the government needs to make sure that people are not left behind because of distrust, exclusion or barriers to access, especially those most at risk. But that work will count for far less if trust in vaccines continues to decline. Conspiracy theories did real damage during the pandemic, and the spread of vaccine misinformation is increasing the risk to public health today. Much more must be done to challenge dangerous conspiracy theories that threaten public health. And where people were seriously harmed after vaccinations, having acted in the public good, they deserve proper support and a fair route to redress. For us, the value of this report lies in what happens next. This report must lead to real change. There will be another pandemic. The government must not turn it back on pandemic preparedness. Thank you.
James Telfer there of COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice, reacting to Module 4 of the COVID inquiry, looking at how vaccines were developed by the likes of AstraZeneca, Pfizer and Moderna, how they were authorised and delivered, as well as any of the side effects as well. We heard the summary from Baroness Heather Hallett saying that vaccine rollout was an extraordinary feat, but more must be done to rebuild trust as well. Let's hear further details.
When Boris Johnson told the country we need to learn to live with COVID, he promised that those at highest risk would be protected. That includes people with health conditions like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and those with weakened immune systems. That promise was not kept. Clinically vulnerable families have been raising the alarm for 6 years. Today, Baroness Hallett has published her findings and recognises the significant need for effective antiviral treatments. The inquiry accepts without reservation that we need to provide protection to the immunocompromised, including through preventative drugs, and that this must be a priority. Baroness Hallett has held that the government should pay close attention to the needs of clinically vulnerable and access to vaccines in a safe environment. We're pleased that the inquiry has recognised the significant difficulties in accessing antivirals, which remain today. The report recognises that vaccines have saved millions of lives. There was an extraordinary national effort. Over 250,000 people still died and continue to die from COVID, and the vast majority were clinically vulnerable, and many of those deaths were avoidable. Millions of people with serious health conditions who continue to receive flu vaccines and have been quietly removed from the COVID vaccine protection programme, but their risk has not gone. And it's because of the cost. It is against the guidance of the World Health Organization, against the evidence. We must remember that the virus didn't disappear, the support did, leaving clinically vulnerable people increasingly exposed. Families are still forced to travel abroad to protect their children, driving to Germany, flying to America, because UK children's vaccine rollout was far too slow, too limited and too short. Even today, clinically vulnerable children are denied vaccines. One doctor in Germany vaccinating a clinically vulnerable child from the UK asked, "Why can't you get this at home?" And for those who can't rely on vaccines for protection, there was another option, a preventative treatment, Evershed, approved for use in the UK, but used in France, Germany, the US, and every other comparable Western country. But we didn't buy it or use it. Shamefully, the UK were the only Western country that didn't. It's clear from the findings that preventative treatments were sacrificed at the expense of the vaccine programme. This was not a failure, it was a choice. 4 years, 4 Prime Ministers, and the people at highest risk are still waiting for protection. Where's Streeting? You promised an end to sticking past politics. You promised a health service that will keep people well, not that just treats them when they become sick. We are asking to meet you. The tools exist, the evidence is clear. Living with COVID should not mean living without protection.
I'm Shannon Banks, and I'm one of the community that's represented by clinically vulnerable families. I'm clinically vulnerable and was invited to get the COVID vaccine in February of 2021, early, as a priority. Unfortunately, the vaccine triggered my lupus and caused heart damage. I was in and out of hospital for 9 months, and I ended up on lifetime heart medication. Understandably, my doctors advised me to no longer get any more COVID vaccines. But when I asked what I should do instead, nothing was made available. Despite the fact that a treatment was approved in the UK, it was not purchased by the UK, and it was not allowed for us to have. As a result, I lived apart from my family for over a year, shielding alone in a flat. I lost a year of my daughter's life as she went through school as a teenager. I lost friends, and I lost work, and I lost time. We are still at risk today, and we need support, and we need an alternative. So not only for the next pandemic do we need an alternative to the vaccines and a multi-tiered approach, we need support now.
Hello, so I'm another member of Clinically Vulnerable Families, and the quote that was there about why couldn't this child get her vaccine at home was actually my daughter, who at the time, at 4 years old and being clinically vulnerable herself and immune suppressed, couldn't access a vaccine within the UK, and I had to take her to Germany. Utterly incredible in this day and age. And I'm sorry to say that really vaccines are no better now. Indeed, the government continually reduces the eligibility list for COVID vaccines, such that even today many people with cancer, heart disease, diabetes, asthma can no longer access COVID vaccines. This is a serious problem, as we know. The NHS is severely under stress at the moment, and particularly during winter, and we just ask the government to seriously reconsider both vaccine offers to vulnerable children and also increasing the eligibility list for adults. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Sarah Stephen. I'm also a member of Clinically Vulnerable Families. My family member currently has cancer. When he caught COVID recently, we knew that there was an antiviral available on the NHS, and we were really happy that that could help him. But we also knew that that antiviral needed to be taken within 5 days. We did a COVID test at home, he was positive. We did another one, he was positive. So we took him straight away to hospital as we were advised on his cancer red card. When we got him there, the hospital did not administer antivirals straight away. Instead, they said they needed to test him again for COVID with their own tests. It needed to be sent off to the lab, and it took days to get the result back. By the time the result eventually came back, that 5-day window for taking the drugs had practically closed. I think it's really important that this report identifies that the system for getting antivirals to the people that need them is broken. It needs to be fixed now, because 5 days is an incredibly short window, and there is no time to waste when dealing with somebody's life or death. I'm really happy that CVF understands that COVID is still a serious issue for people with serious health conditions. There are hundreds of people still dying every week from this, and that includes cancer patients, those with heart disease, diabetes, etc. The list goes on. Most of the people dying are clinically vulnerable, and we're here just to make sure that those people stay alive. Thank you.
Hearing there from families affected by the COVID vaccine rollout, calls there for increased vaccine eligibility and vaccination here in the UK. This is in response to Module 4 of the COVID inquiry that's being chaired by Baroness Heather Hallett. She found that the vaccine and therapeutic programmes were two of the success stories of the pandemic, but more must be done to rebuild trust with the public, according to the inquiry, talking about vaccination programmes being an extraordinary feat, but that also that there were issues nonetheless. Approximately 132 million vaccines given across the 4 nations of the United Kingdom in 2021, making it the largest vaccination programme in UK history. By June 2022, 87% of the UK population aged over 12 had been vaccinated with 2 doses. Our science correspondent Thomas Moore is in central London, near where this module has been made public. And Thomas, I think what's really stark there is the fact that the vaccination programme for the very vast majority of people finished in 2022. But we heard there from families who are affected by it still in 2026, and the calls for more support that continue years after the pandemic ebbed away in its most severe state.
Yes, the after effects of this pandemic are very real and long-lasting for some people. During the pandemic, some clinically vulnerable groups felt overlooked. They felt that there were opportunities to provide them with antibody cocktails and so on that would allow them to leave their house safely and provide them with some protection against the virus, because of course they couldn't have the vaccine, which was so rapidly rolled out to the rest of the population. They strongly feel that was a missed opportunity because the government bailed on rolling out that cocktail. But after that, there were the lingering effects from vaccination for some, sadly, and the feeling that more needs to be done to support them. They came forward, they felt they were doing the right thing. They had in mind those elderly relatives, those clinically vulnerable people that they thought they were also helping to protect by having the jab. But in those rare circumstances, they did suffer quite significant harm in some circumstances. And the compensation scheme, the payment scheme that exists at the moment is just inadequate in those circumstances, nowhere near enough and nowhere sensitive enough to meet the needs and the kind of disability, physical and mental, that they were suffering.
Thomas Moore joining us live in central London, the live page running on that story as well throughout the course of the coming days.